Hello, friends. I hope your test went well. I talked to Mr. Spinola, and he said that he was going to give you some form of an evaluation. Certainly would not have been in the form that we would have given you had you been in class, but nevertheless, I hope that the lectures that we did or the discussions that we had online were helpful for you, and that by this point you have a pretty good kind of grasp and understanding of how we can describe what's going on in the macroeconomy using the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and how we can predict what might happen based on events using that same model. Now we want to shift a little bit, and if we were doing this in class, we would have taken that chapter 29 and chapter 30 together and had one big, gigantic, super hard test on it. But that's not what happened. You had a test on chapter 29, the ADAS model, and now we're going to move to chapter 30, which is entitled Fiscal Policy. Now, what that chapter entails and what that topic entails is a discussion of what, if anything, can we do about some of the problems associated with the macroeconomy. Now, let's go back for a minute and let's talk about some potential problems that might arise in the macroeconomy, and let's suggest that in the last chapter we said that there were basically three problems that might emerge, right? So let's start with the ideal situation. So the ideal situation in the macroeconomy is that aggregate demand equals aggregate supply at a price level and an output level of full employment. So the price level really isn't that important at this point. But if AD equals AS at an output level that is equal to what's required to fully employ all resources at the natural rate, that's an ideal situation. Because if that were true, then the economy would be naturally moving towards an output level that would provide a job for everyone that wants one, right? So it would be the full utilization of the entire labor force to produce an output, right, that society could enjoy. And you really couldn't produce too much beyond that without risking some level of inflation, right? So, okay, let's start there. Let's start with that position. So even if you wanted to draw it, I mean, you've been drawing it, right? Kind of the bow-shaped aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply curve, downward sloping aggregate demand curve, then a price level, that's there, and then output is equal to full employment, right? If you drew that. Now, we said that basically there are three potential problems that might occur. One is that if you're in that position, aggregate demand could go up. If it does, then what we find is what we call demand pull inflation, that people want to buy more than the full employment level of output. Well, since you can't produce too much more than the full employment level of output, that puts pressure on prices to go up, and we call that demand pull inflation. The other problem is that, demand goes down. Now, people want to buy less. C plus I plus X plus G is less than the full employment level of output. The impact of that is typically for output to decline. Since there's not enough demand to buy the full employment level of output, firms eventually cut back on output, and that leads to unemployment and a recession. So one problem is you can have too much demand. Another problem is you can have too little demand, right? And then a third problem is a shift in short-run aggregate supply leftward, right? We said that might occur because of some sort of what we'll eventually call a supply shock, but some sort of change in the per unit cost of production that pervasively affects the entire economy. But let's go back, however, and just talk about the demand-related problems, and that will be the focus of this chapter, those two demand-related problems. One demand-related problem is there's too much demand pull inflation. Another demand-related problem is there's too little demand, right? Recession, right? So in too much demand at the full employment level of GDP, people, C plus I plus X plus G, right, plus X sub N, is higher than full employment, puts pressure on prices to go up. Too little demand is C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub N is not high enough to buy the full employment level of GDP. It puts pressure on production to decline and eventually maybe even prices to decline. Right, so those are the two problems. Now, it would seem like these two problems, which happen periodically, right? I mean, right now, obviously, the problem is that there's not enough demand. That people are panicked, and there's not enough demand to buy the full employment level of GDP. Firms are reducing their output, right? And you have recession. I mean, it's not really a typical recession, but nevertheless, you see elements of there not being enough demand. Well, okay. Right? It raises this question. Is there anything we could do, or is there anything we should do to fix these problems? Well, let's think about this for a second. If the problem is there's too much demand, right? Is there anything we could do to lower it, right? To reduce it? If the problem is there's too little demand, is there anything we could do to increase it? Well, let's go back to demand for a second. What are the elements of demand? Well, the big elements of demand are C, consumption, consumer spending, I sub G, investment spending, G, government spending, and X sub N, foreign spending. So then the more specific question would be this. Can we influence any of those components of aggregate demand when we need to? Right? If C plus I plus X plus G is higher than the full employment level of GDP, can we do something to influence any of those components of demand to reduce it? Right? And if it's lower, can we influence those? Well, let's start with consumption. Right? Can we influence consumption? The fact of the matter is that periodically, policymakers, government, will try to influence consumption without much success, right? Consumption is based fundamentally on two things. Income, how much income is available, and, confidence. Now, policymakers can affect income, and we'll talk about that extensively in this chapter. But they frequently try to influence confidence without much success. I mean, policymakers will tell people, well, look, everything's okay. Go ahead out and spend, or try, look, you're just too much spend, But people base their decisions on their own kind of circumstances. It's unlikely that policymakers can influence confidence. They might be able to influence income, right? We'll come back to that. Investment spending is something that policymakers will try to influence as well. Investment spending is connected to interest rates. Interest rates are something policymakers might try to affect, but that's not really in this unit. Now, let's talk about government. Government, if you think about it, is a big component of total demand, and one that would seem fairly likely, fairly likely to be easily influenced. I mean, the national government is the biggest spender out there, right? The biggest single spender out there, right? So it would seem likely that the national government would be able to alter its spending, right, if it needed to, and that in fact is true. Right, if you have C, consumption, maybe not that easy to influence. I, investment, maybe not that easy to influence, at least quickly. And now we have G, government spending, which is totally under the control of government itself, that they could easily increase or decrease. Right, so let's and foreign spending, obviously, that's a little hard to influence foreigners, but it's certainly possible. But let's focus on G for a second, right? So let's talk about this. Let's say aggregate demand is too high, right? And we have demand pull inflation. Would it be possible for, in that case, government to cut back on its spending, right? And if they did so, would that reduce aggregate demand and somehow put pressure on prices to not rise or to fall, right? Well, the simple answer is yes. Yes, that's something that could happen. Right? On the other hand, what if you're in a recession? Right? What if you're in a deep recession if people aren't spending enough? Could the government come along and decide to spend more? And the answer would be yes. I mean, that's fundamentally what's happening now. Now, government altering the level of spending and or the level of taxation in order to influence aggregate demand and therefore the macroeconomy is referred to as fiscal policy. Let me say that again. Government altering the level of spending and or the level of taxation in order to influence aggregate demand, in order to change the macroeconomy or influence the macroeconomy, is what we call fiscal policy. And fiscal policy is the topic of this chapter. So what we're going to talk about in this chapter is government making a conscious decision to either change the level of spending or change the level of taxation in order to change aggregate demand to address some problem. So, in the simplest sense, because we haven't talked about taxation, I threw that in there, but we haven't talked about taxation just yet, right? We just talked about government spending. So let's say this: in the simplest sense, if there's a recession, right, then government could alter the level of government spending in order to increase demand, so they could spend more, right? I mean, this is something that government is doing right now, and there's talk of it doing more of it, right? Spending more. If there's demand pull inflation, government could spend less, and if there's a conscious decision to spend more or less by government, the national government really only, right, this would be applicable. If there's a conscious decision to spend more or less, then that is called a discretionary fiscal policy. A discretionary fiscal policy. Now, let's stop it there for now, because this is a little bit as a kind of an introduction, and we're going to have to kind of go a little bit, I think, more vigorously to get this sort of all in. I know this is just a taste. This would only be a couple of pages of introduction in chapter 39 in your textbook, which looks like this, right? This would be an example of your textbook. It's backwards, I think. This would be an example of your textbook, right? Don't be afraid to read it, right? Okay. I'll have another video for you soon. All right.